Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Sponge Chat. My name is Jim. I'm a teacher, trainer, manager, and blogger, and I love that all of you lovely people here are again here for another Sponge Chat. To this Sponge Chat, I had the pleasure and the privilege to speak to none other than Adrian Tennant, who is kind of an EOT powerhouse within the training industry. You know, he's a writer, he's an educator. Of course, he's a teacher as well, and we got to look at some of his experiences in training teachers in different contexts around the world. Now, these contexts, there were loads of them. I mean, his CV just goes on and on and on. But the one thing that for me was quite interesting was how different they were to the context in which I've trained. And this difference these differences between contexts was one of the main points we focused on, and trying to highlight the importance of understanding the context and the teachers that you're working with in that context, and understanding that their experiences, their values, their expectations towards training or to teaching may be very different to your own. And so Adrian was trying to highlight this importance and then trying to understand that. We spoke about many other things as well, which, there's some very interesting thoughts on sort of pre-service courses and how they prepare teachers. We also looked at some book recommendations, as usual. It's one of my favorite sections, as you all know, and lots of other little goodies. So I do hope that you enjoy this Sponge Chat. If you do like it, please subscribe. I know that you're going to press that button right now, and give us a thumbs up. And of course, comment. Make this dialogic. Speak with us. I do respond to the comments. I've had people email me. You can do that as well. You can get in touch on LinkedIn, whatever you like. Yeah, just get involved. All right, guys, have a lovely one, and we'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you very much for being here this morning. Before we get into the Sponge Chat, if there's someone that's watching for the first time, I'll just give a brief spiel about what it is, what are Sponge Chats.
Sure.
So basically, this all started from a few years ago. I got an email about how did I move into teacher training, and I thought about it, and then I realized that it's kind of different for all sort of teacher trainers, the routes that we take, if you will. And Sponge Chats now have sort of gone everywhere. We've touched on materials development, we've touched on teacher training, we've touched on managing sorts of things. And my hope is that by showing teachers that there are multiple career paths within EOT, and different ways in which we can achieve these. Hopefully, we can encourage people to stay within the industry and hopefully raise the professionalism overall. I mean, that's a big hope, I suppose, but that's one of my things. So without further ado, let's get into it then. As you know, my first question is always like a philosophical one. Who is Adrian? We'll start with that.
Okay. Well, I'd say I was a teacher. I don't really teach much anymore, although I do teach teachers. Teacher trainer, trainer, author and consultant. Now, when I started training trainers, my mother said to me, she mentioned the Buddhist reincarnation, that you come back as a lower thing each time if you've done something wrong. And that was the kind of thing. And when I put consultant on my business card, my daughter said, "Who made you a consultant?" So, I mean, I would say my work predominantly is teacher training, writing, and consulting now.
Yeah, I mean, you have a very long. I mean, I haven't seen your CV, but I've seen some of your, we'll call them exploits, some of the places that you've been, some of the projects that you've been involved in. And it's a very, very long list. I mean, you've been all over the world, training teachers. I think I even read that there was one project where you were kind of advising on a local course books and or a set of local course books and things like that.
Well, that's happened a couple of times, and that for me is, I mean, one of the things I always say is that if you're successful, you do yourself out of a job.
Okay.
You're constantly having to reinvent or look at new opportunities.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I've had 2 projects where one was in Uzbekistan, where I was asked by a publisher to look at versioning a course book, and I went over and met with people and then said, no, that won't work.
Right.
Let's write it. And they said, well, can you write it? And I said, no. And I said I'd put a local team together. So we did that. That was a very interesting experience. And then a few years ago, I had a similar experience in Cambodia, where I was asked to write the curriculum for Cambodia for the schools. And then write the books. And I again turned around and said, no, but I'll put together a local team to write the books. That was better in that it lasted. I mean, the first one in Uzbekistan, the timeframes were ridiculous. The Cambodian one was much better. And yeah, unfortunately, the pandemic came in the sort of middle of that. So the schools are closed at the moment, and the books are sitting on shelves waiting to be launched.
Right. Okay.
We'll get there.
We'll get there, definitely. This actually, I remember we were, I think we met sort of briefly for the first time at one of the Teacher Training and Education 6 sort of meetups, and this theme about creating sort of local experts came up, and we were talking about teacher training. So I'm gonna come back to that theme later. It seems it's definitely quite an important thing. So we're going to come back to that. But before we do, I suppose, what was your reason to move into teacher education and then later to trainer education?
Initially, I don't think there was a conscious reason. I was just approached by my then director of studies to run some workshops in a language school I worked in. Then later on, I worked for a language school where they'd recruited university graduates, but they hadn't been trained yet. So we had to go into training them. And also at that time, I was working in Eastern Europe, and there was a big project on retraining Russian teachers to become English teachers. Okay. So I was involved in the teacher training part of that. Later on, I decided that this is what I really like doing more than teaching, because I had a bigger impact. When I was teaching, I might teach 500 students in a year, if I was lucky. But if I was training teachers and they went off and worked with their students, the effect was going to be bigger. So I think that became then the conscious reason of why I kept in that field and wanted to do more.
If I reflect on my own experience as a trainer, and I was saying that I consider myself an early career trainer. I'm still within, I'm almost at the 4 or 5 mark of being an employed teacher trainer, and working with with teachers in that way. But I can definitely see what you mean about that feeling of impact, and I suppose that's one of the most rewarding experiences with working with the INSET program that I have in the academy, and seeing teachers develop and then seeing learners become more successful. It's not always, I mean, in fact, I would say it's really, really difficult to measure impact. But
it can be, but I mean, for example, I did a project a number of years ago in Saudi Arabia, working in an English medium school,
right,
with teachers of all different subjects, so science, history, maths, and so on. And I was asked to do a month, and I said, no, I do 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks off, and then 2 weeks back.
Right.
And I went away and I came back after 2 weeks and I went to watch some lessons and I could see that the teachers were still doing things that we talked about. And then I went to see a lesson, and it's probably the best lesson I've ever seen. It was a science lesson. It was a lesson on dissecting, and they were dissecting sharks, which I was like, hang on a minute, I dissected a frog or a bullseye or something. This is
That's
I
crazy.
was extremely jealous. And the teacher said, right, I'm going to give you the worksheet, and handed out a blank sheet of paper. And then the students had to fill in the blank sheet of paper based on what they found when they were dissecting the shark.
Okay.
And they had their textbooks next to them, and the teacher didn't do anything other than just sort of cough when they were going to make a mistake. And the students would look at each other, and at the end of the lesson, they'd filled in a sheet of paper. And I was a little nervous about this because these students were in their final year and they've got their final exams, which are a big, big deal. And so I stayed back afterwards and interviewed the students, and I said, so what do you think? And they said, well, why aren't all our teachers doing this? We've learned more in the last 2 weeks than we learned in the last 2 years, because we're having to think. And you could immediately see the impact, because the impact wasn't on the teaching, the impact was on the learning.
On the learning perceptions, yeah.
And they were more than aware of what was happening to them.
Yeah. That's a really good example, I think. I imagine that the teaching before that must have been significantly different.
It was a lecture of, or open your book and page da 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 da.
Right.
Here's what this means. Do you understand?
Just take these ideas, like complete transmission, right? Just
Yeah. And it was fantastic. I mean, the sessions were really interesting because every time the sessions were at the end of the teaching day, so from 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the evening, or 6 till 10 or whatever. And every day the teachers would say, that won't work. And I'd go and try it. And after about a week and a half, one of the Egyptian teachers, who was very, very cynical and very critical, I said, how about doing this? And he looked at me and he went, that won't, oh, go and try it. And that was that was a breakthrough moment for him, when he realized that, okay, it may work, it may not, but I have to have a go and try it. And I go with that.
I think that's an important aspect of being a trainer. No, often we talk about the teachers' values, attitudes, beliefs, expectations, these sorts of things, and it's quite well known that teachers' personal teaching theories are often stronger than the things that they see as evidence. But then as trainers, part of our responsibility is to try and expose them to extra ideas, but support them in implementing them. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think also as trainers, our responsibility is to allow them to take small steps and not expect radical changes.
Yeah.
And to understand, I mean, I've seen this happen a lot, not so much with teachers, I've seen it with teachers, but I've seen it certainly with students, where students have got 17 years of doing things in a certain way. And then they're told that what they've been doing is wrong and they have to do it in this way. Well,
yeah, you're fighting an uphill battle there. Yeah.
No, if they've had 17 years of doing it in a particular way, and whether or not it's worked for them, it's what they're used to.
Yeah.
Why are they going to do things differently?
Definitely. I mean, those sorts of when I was reading an article the other day on sort of educational change, and how even if the change is going to be really beneficial, there's always going to be challenges. And even if teachers realize that it's going to be beneficial, there's still going to be negative reactions of sorts, because there's changes involved. I think they're important, but it must be an important consideration. I mean, you've obviously worked in context where some of these ideas that you were asking teachers to implement seemed quite alien, perhaps.
It's not only that, it's that the context where you're asking for those ideas to be implemented, it may be, you know, I can remember working in India and saying to the teachers, "Oh, just get a student to come up from the and write on the board," and they were like, "Well, if they do that, they won't be able to sit back down." And I was like, hmm. So I went into the classroom, and yeah, the kids are crammed onto a bench. There's 25 of them on a bench for 15. As soon as the kid stands up, everybody else takes the room, and then the kid will turn around, and there's no space on the bench anymore because the other kids have taken it up. So you need to understand the limitations of what you're asking people to do and the context that they're working in. And quite often we make suggestions which are totally impractical for the context that those teachers are working in. I mean, a good example is large classes. I've done quite a lot of work with people like Harry Kucha on talking about large classes. And people talk about a large class being 45. Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, often classes are in primary and secondary are 200.
That's crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just, I think about my own teaching as well as training experiences, and they've been in a very European context. And it's only recently in the last maybe 2 years I've thought, and in fact, one of the discussions which we had at the SIG meetup got me really thinking about this idea of understanding the context and how, working in places like Africa or India, they must be completely different. And as an expert that's brought in here, what you said about you refusing to do it and then getting the locals to do it, that must have been one of the reasons why, right? Because of their local knowledge. Is that
yeah,
correct?
and it's also, for example, you'll get people who talk about things like you'll go into a context and you'll say, "Oh, well, let's talk about communicative language teaching," and they go, "Oh, we do that."
Yeah.
But their concept of communicative language teaching is completely different from what yours might be. Yeah. So the danger is that you've got shared terminology, but the reality is not shared at all.
Right.
So when somebody says they do X, you need to be able to say, well, okay, well, what actually do you do? What is X that you do? Yeah. And then look at it. I was talking to somebody recently at a conference about this, about communicative language teaching, and you'll get somebody in China saying, yeah, I teach communicatively. And they'll say, look, they'll hold this up to the students and they'll go, they'll go, is this a plane? No, it's not. Is it a book? No, it's not. What is it? It's a phone. Yes. And then they'll say, I talk communicatively because the students were communicating with me. And yeah. You'll sit there and go, okay, right. Now, how do we move this on?
Yeah. Some of the, when you encounter some of these perhaps differences or things that you've noted that you would like to provide feedback on, and because they're so culturally situated or context specific, do you find it difficult to implement those new ideas or get teachers to try out new ideas?
Not necessarily, but I think one of the dangers is that how you go about learning about the context. Because, for example, let's take a country like Pakistan. You might be asked to do some work in Pakistan. You read up on things, you read up on the education system and so on. And then you go in there, but you've been reading up about the state system. and you're going to be working with teachers who work in the private sector.
Right.
It's completely different.
Mm.
So you think you're prepared for the context, but you're not.
Yeah.
So I think one of the important things is to be aware that contexts are not country or culture specific.
Mm.
And within your within the training you're doing, you need to be flexible and you need to be listening. I mean, listening is a key thing. I know you asked about books. It wasn't one I was going to suggest, but in terms of this, it's one that I think is good. It's a book by Wright and Belotho called Teacher Development. And it's based on a context where they were working in sub-Saharan Africa and where they co-constructed the course with the teachers on it. I think for trainers starting out, that's quite a challenge to do. But it's something that trainers who are starting out, when they first go into different contexts, need to be
able to do, right?
Able to do, yeah.
I read that book. Must have been about almost 2 years ago now, and I think that in terms of value for money, that book has probably had the largest impact on my trainer self than many other books, I think. And it's a brilliant book. It's been recommended quite a lot. But we'll come back to book recommendations. It's one of my favorite sections of Sponge Chats. So we've spoken about, professional Adrian and your teacher training self. We've looked at, the rationale for moving into teacher training. We've also talked briefly about some of the context in which you've taught or trained, I should say. Are there any contexts that stand out as perhaps the most interesting or the most difficult, or the one that you would like to go back to the most?
I think all of the contexts, all of the places are interesting. I suppose one of my most memorable experiences was working in Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan with Syrian teachers. And this is about thinking of the context. So I'd had discussions with different people who'd worked in a camp and other people who'd worked in similar kind of situations. And the first thing we were going to do was kind of a mini conference where we'd be presenting ideas. So my idea was to do something which I call teaching from nothing. So I turn up and I just look around and pick up whatever I can find and then use that to teach with. So we turned up at the camp and I opened the door and climbed out, and the place was spotless because they cleaned it because we were turning up. So I kind of looked around and went, I don't have a lesson, do I? And that was just really, really strange in that you make an assumption.
Yeah. And
of course, they're making an assumption that they need to make everything shipshape and so on.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was really, really interesting. And it was interesting then, I got to work with a charity called Relief International, and also to do as a consultant to do monitoring and evaluation of various United Nations programs. And all of those were very interesting because you'd, again, have to sit down and talk to the students. And we had interpreters, which meant that we had to tell the interpreters not to put words into the mouths of the students. And
right.
And I can remember one of the students, a girl, chatting away in Arabic to her friend, and I turned around and said in Arabic, Yash. which is yes, or interesting. And she looked at me and startled of, you speak Arabic? I don't, but it's always good to have a few words just to
show that you're trying to, right? Trying to be part of that power.
Yeah, and also to try and get them to be to trust you in a way, to be able to open up. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, they sound really, really interesting. And some of those projects, I mean, working in the refugee camp or some of the projects in the UN, they must have been some, I mean, large undertakings, but also really rewarding experiences, I can imagine.
yeah, and fascinating. Think every context you work in, there's differences and there's challenges. Working in, for example, in Francophone West Africa, and running a course and then saying at the end, okay, we'll do a course again next year. 30% of you will come back, but the 30% who come back will be people who implement something and give us evidence they've implemented something and tell us what they implemented and what the impact was, and so on. And then the following year, there'd been a young lad who taught in a small village who'd really gone out of his way to try and do things. So we invited him back. And then a few people who worked for the ministry or were senior people said, why aren't I being invited back? And we said, well, you haven't done anything. Yeah, but I'm with the ministry.
Wow.
Like, and the criteria were clear.
Yeah.
And you get that kind of pushback, and you get that kind of assumption that because of who you are, you're going to be, and you're inviting this young teacher back, and he's a nobody.
Yeah.
And you get, I've had an interesting discussion once with the Ministry of Education for Mauritania, where their training program is that their pre-service, the teachers who finish that are then sent to the furthest flung schools with the least resources and the least support. And if they last 5 years, then they're allowed to go back to the city.
Okay, that's interesting.
They need it the other way around.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
And I think I've written articles on that type of thing where, the most important time for learning is the young age, and those are the teachers that often have the least training and the least support.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I mean, both the things that you brought up there about those conversations and the point about at the young age. Those conversations must be quite difficult. Obviously, you're sort of blending, the idea of politics and education here when you're having to deal with these conversations, and that must have been difficult situations, I imagine. Speaking about difficult situations or challenges specific to teacher training, and it could be teacher training in the local context or an international context, whatever it might be. Are there any challenges with teacher training that you have come across and have recognized as, okay, that's something that I need to work on or that I need to deal with? And if so, how did you get around that, apart from the ones that you've already mentioned so far?
Yeah, I think sometimes the challenges are ones that you could or you should predict, but you don't necessarily, because you've made the assumption that you've been asked to come in because you're going to offer something. And trying to persuade people. So a good example is I spent 5 years going back and forth to a city called Chongqing in China, working with all of the teachers from primary up to upper secondary in helping them use more English in the classroom. And the first challenge we had was that the material we were given to use was, well, it was at B1 level. And if they're at B1 level, they don't need English for the classroom because they already have English at that level. So we needed to simplify the material and also make it culturally appropriate.
Right.
And then I can remember on about the 4th year, I'd been working with a group of teachers, and then I was working with a second group. And while I was working with the second group, I popped down to see what the first group were doing. And they were having lectures with a local Chinese trainer. And he had his PowerPoint at the front, and he was talking to them in Chinese. And most of them had their heads down on the desk and weren't paying attention. And we had lunch together, and I said to him, "What were you doing?" And he said, "I was telling the importance of using English in the classroom." And I said, "Oh, okay, that was interesting because you were doing it in Chinese." And he said, "Oh, of course, because if I did it in English, they wouldn't understand." And you're just sitting there thinking, okay, so I'm working with these teachers for 2 weeks on using English, then they're being told to use English, but they're being told in Chinese, and the message is being completely garbled.
Definitely.
What do I do? How do I tackle this with the ministry to persuade them that we need to, that what they're doing is not going to work? And it is a delicate situation it's a political situation where you don't want to ruffle feathers, but you do need to make a point.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, that's, I mean, I don't think I've ever been in a situation like that where I haven't been on an advisory board or anything like that. So, but difficult conversations, I imagine. But like you said, the idea is to create impact and recognize when things are not being done right. So obviously you need to raise them in some way.
You have to discuss them. I mean, again, another situation in China, which was slightly interesting. It was a consultancy, not a train. It was to put together a training package. And the idea was that we were putting together teams of trainers who were going to train online, and they were going to train 50,000 teachers across the country.
Wow.
Yeah, the numbers are huge.
That's insane.
And my digital consultant was a guy called Russell Stannard.
Yeah,
Russell flew out, and we went to a place which was supposedly the leading online training center in China. And we arrived just as the head was giving his latest online lesson, which was with 3 teachers in a province in China. And he said, "Okay, so did you do your homework?" And they went, "Yes." And he said, "Great, okay, I'll see you next week." And that was it. And I sat there and I said, "Okay, Russ, I think you need to go out and set up." So Russell left the room to set up an online training thing. And they looked at us and they said, "Well, where's he gone?" I said, "Well, we're doing it online, so he's gone to a different room." "Oh, well, why? Why isn't he here?" And their whole concept of online training was just so different.
So different, yeah.
To what we were trying to advocate. So yeah, I mean, talking to Russell later on in the evening was just hilarious.
I can imagine.
We had a train. There was 3 of us on the advisory panel. Yeah, myself, a Chinese counterpart, and Russell for the tech side of it. And Russell had spent hours working with a Chinese colleague on. So he'd be in his hotel room, she'd be in her hotel room. He'd set it up so that she'd have to go online and to try and
Get them into it, right?
get her into what we were trying to do,
Yeah.
so that she could then explain to the people we were working with how it would work.
Yeah. And on these, when you do these sort of advisory projects, do you ever get the chance? I mean, you mentioned that you, with one of them, that you had another course a year later, and for those that did stuff, they could come back, or implemented ideas and had evidence. Is that quite common? Do you often get the chance to go back a year later and see how, or see what impact there was?
No,
Right.
and that's a shortcoming of a lot of training courses. It's happened in a few places, and I do think that the pandemic will help in terms of we may move to a more hybrid model,
Right.
where there aren't so big issues with funding. So you do an initial visit and training, then you do a follow-up online.
Online. Yeah.
And I think that hopefully will help with impact, because I really wish I could remember who it was, but there's somebody who wrote quite a long time ago about shortcomings of teacher training and educational training, where they're one-off course of 2 weeks and that's it. A lot of organizations are becoming better at putting into place monitoring and evaluation. But the problem is they tend to be tagged on at the end rather than being designed from the outset as part and parcel of the whole
package, right?
Program.
That's really interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say it's even just specific to these contexts that, you know, non-European. I mean, I look at our own context, in my own context in Spain. You know, I've been on courses and I suppose evaluation is carried out at the end, and then there's nothing. There's no follow-up, not even emails or things like that. Obviously, I understand logistically it's difficult at times, and you know, I was sorry. Continue.
I think it's because of the lack of understanding of how you fund things. So all the funding goes into the initial program, and there's no funds left over. And it always reminds me of something a friend of mine talks about when he talks about technology. And again, it's somebody you've probably come across, Gavin Dudney. And Gavin talks about hardware, software, and wetware. And he says most schools and most institutions put 70% of money into hardware, 30% into software, and nothing into wetware. And wetware is the support for when things go wrong. Okay. It's training and the guide to fix the interactive whiteboard when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And he said, and they got it all wrong, because they need to put at least half the money aside for the wetware, the training and the support. Yeah. Because otherwise you do all of this training and nobody can use it because it breaks down.
Yeah, completely agree.
And I think the same for teacher training, that everything is put into the initial course, the initial hardware, with nothing left over for supporting
for the rest.
And for the rest.
Yeah. That's some excellent points there. I think about my own context. I'm very lucky. I work in an academy where, so I'm the director of studies at the academy, but the director and sort of the owners, they value, I mean, they put quite a lot of money into the training and development and making sure that it's evaluated throughout the whole year, so that they let me continue that throughout the whole year. And so I feel like I'm very lucky in that. I would say this is with an internal context, not on a course that's sort of inset. But I still feel that even that's quite rare, you know, that amount of money or support that's focused on development within academies or institutions itself themselves. I think that's quite rare, at least within my experience of teaching in Italy and Spain. So I'm very lucky with that. Hopefully more wetware. I like that. I like that idea of hardware, software. It's very nice. Okay, so let's shift the focus now. Let's say you have a group of teachers, or even just a single teacher, and they come to you and they say, "Look, I've been teaching for a few years, and I'd like to try my hand at teacher training, or moving into teacher education in some way." What pieces of advice would you have for this teacher?
Well, I think the most logical way of moving into it is like I did, like you have, when you're working in an institution and you've got the chance to do a workshop or do some kind of training there. I think it's also important to go to conferences, and when you go to sessions, participate when you can.
Yeah.
The other advice really is look at what skills you've got that are transferable. If you're going to be applying for some form of training that's been advertised, you're likely to be up against people who've got years of experience. So you need to be able to say, well, look, I can do this because, as I said earlier, if I'm successful, I do myself out of a job.
Right.
So I'm constantly having to look at what skills I've got that I can transfer.
Yeah.
And I think it's becoming more. I think that's becoming more recognised. That I've had a few interviews now where it's been competency based. So it's been on what you can do rather than what you've done.
What you've done, right?
And I think that's important. And think about, if you want to go into training, what are you going to bring with you to that? I think a mistake I made when I was starting out was to go into places and say to the people I was working with, well, I'm not really the expert, you are, because you work in this context. They don't want to hear that.
No.
Why are they paying you to come in if you don't know what you're doing? So you have to know your limitations, but you mustn't say that you're not going to be able to do the job.
Yeah.
So however inexperienced you are, you need to be able to look at what you can bring and what you can transfer from other contexts and other areas.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you a very good example. Many years ago, I was asked to be the assessor, the final assessor on a kindergarten training course. I wasn't part of the training. I was just assessing the people at the end of whether they were successful. And I was like, I've never taught in kindergarten. So I immediately went to a kindergarten and said, look, can I teach once a week for a year and see what it's like? And it was my worst teaching experience I've ever had. I had no control over these kids at all. And then I sat in on classes of these people that come off their training, one or 2 year training course. And they all had immaculate control over the kids. And I just sat there in awe and just went, well, they've all passed because...
They've all passed. Yeah. That's That's really interesting. I think what you mentioned about, being able to transfer those skills, but also to recognize your limits. I mean, I think one advice that I would have is to try and teach in different areas, or as many areas as you can, to get a little bit of experience and see how it feels. But you're never going to be able to teach in all the contexts possible.
No, and if you're going to be working, I mean, if you're working within your own academy or your own region, city, whatever it be, yeah, you probably have a very clear idea. But if you're going to start working in lots of other contexts, whether it's Southeast Asia, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, you're not going to have the opportunity to work in those contexts, and certainly not for long enough to get an idea. And also, if you're like us, white male, so-called native speakers, you're going to get a completely different experience than somebody who isn't.
Yeah, definitely.
So your experience isn't a replication of what their experience is like.
Yeah.
And you've got to know that, you've got to understand that before you go in, because otherwise you're going to fail.
Yeah.
Miserably.
Yeah, completely. I mean, obviously, I haven't taught in any context that have been very, very different to where I am now. But even within the context that I have trained, I think this idea of skipping over participants' experiences or knowledge that they bring to the training session can be, a biggest sort of a pitfall to avoid, really.
But if you're working, for example, in your context, if you're working with Spanish-speaking English teachers, you haven't got a shared experience with them.
No, exactly. This is my point. But we need to bring their experiences into there.
Without saying that you don't know, that they're the experts. You mustn't say that, because
it's interesting to look at these the dynamics of the sessions, of the courses, and some of the things that you need to take into account. It's still something that I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I'm still very much working and trying to understand that and how best to approach it. I imagine it's something obviously you've developed over many, many years of working in different contexts and being able to do that. I suppose
the key thing is about listening and trying to empathize. So an example would be, and again, this is something I'm going to bring up later. We often talk about this thing about pre-sessional and in-sessional, or service in service, and I think that that's a misnomer, because I can remember once working with I had a teacher who arrived, who taught up in the Basque country, and he was on a training course, and he said to me, I teach religion, history of religion, in Spanish to fourth graders.
Wow.
Or eighth graders, or whatever. I've just been asked to teach, or he taught philosophy, or I can't remember. Anyway, he was just being asked to teach a completely different subject to a completely different grade in English.
Jeez, wow.
And he looked at me and said, I've got no clue what to do. I've been teaching for 30 years, but this is just totally new for me. And this is this idea of, is this in service? No, it's not. He's a starter teacher because he's starting out in a completely new area.
Yeah,
and every time as a trainer, if you're starting out in the new, you're working with a new group of teachers, even if it might be a familiar context, you're still starting out with them.
Yeah. That's a big change.
Oh yeah,
that's a huge change.
and
But
you see things like, you see a Ministry of Education like Rwanda did this. In May, decided that in September the following academic year, all subjects were going to be taught in English. Now, the fact that they didn't have any textbooks in English, most of the teachers didn't speak English, wasn't going to be a deterrent to the ministry, because it was a political decision.
yeah,
It was a geopolitical decision based on where the country is situated.
yeah,
and you could go in there and tell them it wouldn't work. They didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear what you could do to help them make it work.
right.
Now, obviously, you're not going to go in there and tell them you can do miracles, but you are going to go in there and talk to them about a sensible plan.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, that's very interesting. No textbooks, low proficiency of teachers. That's difficult. Difficult is the only word I can say to that. Speaking about books, though, you mentioned the books, which leads us on to our sort of the final section, if you will, of Spanish, which is perhaps my favorite section. Books, recommendations. I always ask for recommendations. For trainers, or for teachers looking to get into training, or even something that you think teachers should read in general. Have you got any for us?
Yes, I have.
Okay, brilliant.
The first is a book called Teacher Development Over Time by Tessa Woodward, Kathleen Graves, and Donald Freeman. Now, it's aimed at teachers, but I think it makes you think. I went to a workshop that they were running when this book first came out, and I remember they ran us through a couple of the activities, and I was sitting next to a guy who I'd worked with before, who's probably around the same age as me, and we were talking about overhead projectors.
Okay, yeah, I remember them. Yeah.
Which dated us considerably. And we were talking about how useful they've been, and how in some respects they were a lot easier, because you could get students to write onto a transparency, bring a transparency and put it up. You could work with that and everybody could see it and so on. And how some of the innovations and the technology that we've introduced have actually been detrimental to some of the ideas we're using. So I think that's a fantastic book, and certainly one that you can dip in and out of it. You don't have to read it from cover to cover. Another one I'm going to recommend, and I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, and this is available free online from the British Council. It's called Starter Teachers. Okay. And it's written by, it's co-written by 3 teachers from Gabon in Africa, and myself. And it was based on a course that I ran with these teachers and some other teachers in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're talking very much about, for example, there are plenty of contexts where there is no pre-service training.
Right.
And again, I can remember once working in India with Open University and going to a school and going to watch classes and seeing a teacher who was probably in his early to mid 80s, and he came over to me and he said, "Oh, you're the first person who's ever seen me for 60 years teaching."
Wow. Wow. That's
Coming over and saying, "What do you think? What am I doing? Is it okay?" And I was sitting there going, "Now, how do you
how
tell
do
me that? Probably not."
that's insane. That's crazy. But I mean, it's not for that context, right? This is the thing that you need to wrap our head around. Like that, it's that's normal there.
Yeah, I mean, you hear about similar situations, not of teaching for 60 years, but certainly similar situations of no pre-service training for teachers in primary schools.
Yeah.
In Europe.
That's wow.
Or they've done a degree in English literature.
And then they're chucked into a primary classroom. It's like, okay.
Well, I think, I'm a big critic of some of the pre-service training courses that are offered to teachers or supposed teachers. I did a course. My first course was a 4-week course. We only taught multilingual groups. I then got a job and I was given a group of 7-year-olds. I had no
experience at all, right?
Experience, no training, no background. I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I had very little support. It was just assumed that because I'd done this course and passed and got a certificate,
yeah,
we're good to go. I'd love to take people on these training courses and throw them into an African class and just watch them.
Yeah. I think, in fact, I remember.
There's one other book I would recommend, but not the reason, not necessarily for. We started with a philosophical question. This is a book by a guy called John Taylor Gatto, and it's called Dumbing Us Down. And it's about how education systems in the West, and particularly this is focused on the US, are designed to get rid of creative thinking,
right?
Get rid of critical thinking, and basically produce people who are ready to go and work in the factories.
Okay.
And it's quite eye-opening, and especially eye-opening when you hear all this stuff about 21st century skills. And critical thinking and creativity are high on the list. And yet you go into schools.
And it's different.
And it's very, very different. I'm always reminded of going into schools in places like South Korea and Japan, where when you look at our perception of Japanese people is that they all follow the same rules, they all do things in the same way and so on. You go into a class of 6-year-olds in Japan and it's chaos. Not chaos because the teacher's not got control, but chaos because the kids are just coming up with all their own ideas.
Right.
And it's great to see that they're so creative and independent and so on. But if you look around, I mean, there's still this drive towards certificates, and I've done a number of Coursera courses, and I used to try and get certificates. And now I'm thinking, no, the purpose of doing it is for my own learning.
The learning, yeah.
And you'd see courses where people have found a way to get around the structure in order order to obtain the certificate.
The certificate.
That was their goal, was to get the certificate.
Yeah.
And they do, you know, they'd plagiarize, they'd cheat, and you ended up thinking, well, if people are going to do that, the certificate's not worth anything.
Mm.
If I'm going to do the course, I'm going to do it for my own benefit. So I just did a course a couple of weeks ago on psychology with the Yale University, which is really interesting.
Mm.
I think far more rewarding in that I was just interested in doing it for the sake of doing it, rather than interested
in getting the certificate now.
The paper at the end,
Yeah.
But that book's, and it's not a thick book. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting read.
No, definitely. Well,
it's sort of on the same lines as the people like Dewey and Freire, Paulo Freire, and so on have spoken about as well.
Yeah, very, very sort of well-known names within education. I mean, those three books that you mentioned. So you had Teacher Development over Time, Starter Teachers, and Dumbing Us Down. And you also had Trainer Development before by Wright and Belitha. I mean, they sound. I mean, I don't think I've had the last three. Haven't been recommended so far. But the Teacher Development over Time, I think that's a recent. It's quite a new book, no, in the last 2 or 3 years, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it was about 2018.
Yeah.
But obviously, we've lost 2 years
of
of conferences and of interaction where people are
talking about these sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually on my list to read. I'm about to do the trainer development module at Nile, and it's on the reading list. So it's definitely there. But the Starter Teachers one is one that I think is probably the most interesting. And you mentioned it's for free. We can access it on the British Council site, correct?
Yeah. It's on one of the. I think it might be the British Council Teach English website or something like that.
Brilliant.
But I mean, they've got a search facility. You just click on the search thing, type Starter Teacher methodology, and it'll come up, and then it's a downloadable PDF.
Brilliant, excellent. Yeah, that sounds like one of the most interesting ones. I'd like to take a look at that. So I'll definitely put links to that in the blog as well, and hopefully we can get some other teachers reading that. Going back to your point about sort of the pre-service course, I remember in the teacher training SIG meetup, I think there was a teacher from Africa, and she was sharing her experience about why she came and she got a CELTA, and she was saying so that she felt like a real teacher, and part of me was like, I mean, one, her context in teaching in Africa, I think you briefly discussed this with her, was very different to what was taught on the CELTA in I think she did it in the UK. She went to the UK to do the CELTA. Do you find that that's a lot, like teachers in these contexts, they want to do these courses because they think that that's what a teacher is?
Yeah, and there's the prestige of it being linked to a UK institution,
right,
or an American institution. I mean, I'd have to say that, you know, I've been to the one of the big teacher training institutions in India, in Hyderabad, and I'd say what they get there is far more worthwhile and far better than what they'd get in a UK institution and context, but it's not seen in the same light, and not given the same value, which I think is a real shame. I mean, I do think that, for example, if you've got a teacher who spent 4 years at university, 4 or 5 years at university, studying in their own country, and not only studying language and linguistics, but also studying methodology, and spending 6 months in a school placement, and then what they've done is valued less than a 4-week
That's ridiculous.
course done in the UK.
It's absurd.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
And you were talking about, one of your desires to make the profession more professional. I think one way of making it more professional is for more people to stand up and say, hang on a minute, this is absurd.
Yeah.
We need to be, like when I did my master's, I was a director of studies and teacher trainer in a language institution, and I made sure that the modules I was doing were directly relevant to my situation, which made it a much more useful course than just doing a master's. If I did it by distance, and if I'd done it, in 3 months, I probably wouldn't have got anywhere near as much as I got out.
Definitely.
Doing it in the way I did it. And I think, I've done a whole series of courses since then, including another degree, more a mixture, things of my personal interest, and then things that I think, the psychology course I've just done, I think there was stuff that I learned on that I could certainly apply to some of the contexts I work in.
Right.
Or apply to myself in my own personal development.
Yeah.
So I think those are, key things. As a trainer, I think you always need to be developing yourself.
Mm. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. The more I read, the more I expand the sort of the topics that I look at, the more I realize that it's necessary to do so. And not only focusing on, our industry, language teaching. There are many insights that can be brought in from, mainstream education or psychology.
When I was first asked to work on monitoring and evaluation of it was a UN project actually, and I couldn't really find any literature on monitoring and evaluation in ELT. And the model I ended up looking at and adapting came from dentistry in Australia.
Wow. Okay. Geez, there you go. Yeah. That's crazy. But it goes to show that there are insights that are extremely valuable from, not just within language teaching. Hence, people should be reading more and more and more, and experimenting and things like that.
Yeah, and not limiting yourself to ELT materials and ideas, looking at other things. And if you've got an interest, so I'd always had an interest in things like anthropology and archaeology, so I've done courses on those. Creative writing, I've done courses on those, and so on. Was never good at science in school, but was very interested in things like forensics, and I did a course in, what was it? It was to do with genes and the way it was genetics. That's it. Yeah, genetics. And again, I had a very interesting experience. I was on a boat going down the Yangtze in China, and the boat was all Chinese apart from me, a French-Israeli couple, and on our table was a Chinese family who lived in Shanghai, but the kids spoke brilliant English, and I was like interested. And it turned out that the father they'd been born in the States in Houston.
Right.
And the father was a geneticist and he'd just been hired back by a university in China to be the head of the department after spending 17 years in the States. And we started talking about genetics, and he was looking at me going, how do you know all of this stuff? And I said, I'm just learning it. I'm now talking to you because it helps reinforce my learning. And you get into all sorts of weird discussions because you're not so focused and narrow on one topic or one area. I mean, my first degree was in history. I did that because I didn't know what to do.
Okay, fair enough. And then obviously you fell in love with language teaching.
I fell in love with the idea of being able to go to different countries and experience the countries, and language teaching was my way into doing that. I never planned on being involved in ELT. I didn't even know what ELT was, but it certainly didn't plan on being involved in ELT in 30 years' time.
And now look where we are. Well, I mean, it's been absolutely amazing to speak to you today, Adrian, about your experiences. Very, very, very different from my own, and also to look at the advice that you have and some of the book recommendations. I won't keep you any longer. Again, thank you very much for being here, and I do look forward to hopefully meeting in person at when conferences start getting back into it in the short term. Hopefully soon.
Sure.
All right, mate. Well, have a lovely day, and we'll speak to you soon. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jim.